Everyone ignored the storm warning, but I stayed home with my kids, documented everything, and the next morning, social media finally saw what they refused to believe. The storm warning started out small, almost like background noise in the middle of an already hectic week. At first, the alerts were just scrolling tickers at the bottom of the local news broadcasts. Severe weather watch for the coastal counties. Then, as the days inched closer to Friday, the tone shifted. What had been a cautious suggestion turned into flashing red alerts and concerned meteorologists with maps covered in dark red splotches. Still, no one around me seemed to take it seriously. At school pickup, the other parents laughed about how the weather people always overreacted. My neighbors planned their usual weekend barbecue, joking that a little rain would just make the food taste more authentic. Even at work, when I mentioned making sure the backup generator in our garage was fueled, my coworkers rolled their eyes and said, "You're way too paranoid. These storms never hit us directly." But deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that something was different this time. Maybe it was the way the air had grown heavier over the last few days, pressing down like an invisible weight on our shoulders. Maybe it was the birds that had started flying inland earlier than usual, disappearing from the power lines and the trees in our neighborhood. Or maybe it was the memory of last year's minor storm that knocked out our power for 2 full days and left us scrambling for bottled water. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake it, and I wasn't about to gamble with my children's safety. On Thursday night, while everyone else was posting memes online about the so-called hurricane, I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, making lists. Water, non-perishable food, batteries, chargers, flashlights, blankets. I checked the storm shutters I had installed the year before and texted my brother, reminding him to do the same. His reply came with a laughing emoji. "Relax. Sis, you watch too much news." But as I walked through the house, tucking away important documents into waterproof folders and filling the bathtub with water, just in case, I didn't feel foolish. I felt prepared. Friday morning dawned with an eerie quiet. The skies were still blue, the sun still blazing, and the neighborhood looked just as it always did. Kids waiting for the bus, joggers with earbuds bouncing to their rhythms, dogs tugging on their leashes. I could almost understand why people didn't believe the warnings. But when I turned on the weather radio, the tone in the announcer's voice made my heart skip. The storm had shifted course overnight. Instead of brushing past the coast, it was heading straight for us. I kept my kids home from school that day, ignoring the disapproving look from one of the moms at the bus stop. "Overreacting much," she muttered under her breath as she marched her children toward the bus. I wanted to tell her that I hoped I was wrong, that I hoped I'd look silly by tonight, but my gut told me otherwise. Instead, I smiled tightly and ushered my children back into the house. We spent the morning preparing together, moving toys and bikes into the garage, bringing the patio furniture inside, and making a cozy little corner in the living room with blankets, snacks, and board games. I explained to them that it was just like a big sleepover, except we had to listen closely to what was happening outside. By afternoon, the winds had already started picking up. Loose papers swirled down the street, and the trees bent just slightly, as if bowing to something far away but approaching fast. I took out my phone and began recording, just short clips at first. The calm before the storm, I narrated, showing the empty street where normally kids would be riding their bikes. My social media feed, however, was full of people posting selfies at bars, laughing over drinks or joking about surviving the big bad storm with margaritas. Some even tagged the local meteorologists, mocking them for fear-mongering. I shook my head. How could they not see it? By evening, the sky had turned an unnatural shade of gray, like someone had pulled a heavy curtain across the horizon. The wind roared louder, rattling the shutters, and my youngest clung to me as the lights flickered once, then twice, before plunging us into darkness. The generator kicked in with a low hum, and I whispered soothing words to calm them. I picked up my phone again and began documenting everything. The way the rain pounded against the shutters like fists, the way branches cracked and snapped somewhere in the distance, the way the street outside slowly transformed into a river, water rushing down with terrifying speed. At one point, I glanced at the local Facebook community group, hoping for updates, but what I saw instead made my stomach twist. Photos of people still out at restaurants, smiling with drinks raised high, posts mocking those of us who had fallen for the weather hype. And yet, even as they typed those words, I could hear the howling wind outside my home, see the water creeping closer to my driveway. I recorded it all. I filmed the moment a massive tree branch snapped and landed across the neighbor's lawn, barely missing their car. I captured the streetlights flickering and finally dying, plunging the block into a surreal shadow. My kids huddled under blankets, and I spoke to the camera quietly, documenting how we stayed calm, how we had prepared, how we were safe because we took the warnings seriously. It was long past midnight when the full force of the storm hit. The sound was indescribable, like a freight train crashing through the walls, like the earth itself groaning in protest. My shutters held, but the house trembled with each gust. I sat awake the whole night, holding my children close, whispering that we were okay, that this was why we had prepared. My phone battery drained faster than I expected, but I saved every clip I could, uploading them whenever the signal held long enough. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence. The streets were unrecognizable, cars half submerged, fences torn down, debris scattered like confetti from some cruel celebration. I opened the shutters carefully and stepped outside with my phone still recording. The air smelled of damp earth and salt, and the sky, now a pale and innocent blue, seemed to mock the destruction below it. And still, when I checked my social feeds, there were people insisting it hadn't been that bad. Some even posted photos of their nights out, joking about how they survived. That was when I knew my documentation mattered. Because I had the proof. Proof of the destruction, proof of the fear in my children's eyes, proof of the storm's reality, proof that ignoring warnings wasn't just arrogance, it was dangerous. I didn't say anything yet. Not online. Not to my neighbors. Not even to my brother, who texted me sheepishly that his house had lost power and they hadn't prepared at all. I just kept filming, capturing every detail, quietly preparing for what I knew would come next, the moment when people would no longer be able to deny what had really happened. The morning after the storm felt almost surreal, like stepping into a world both familiar and alien. The streets I had walked countless times were now rivers of debris, strewn with broken branches, fallen fences, and the twisted remains of signs and mailboxes. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, salt, and the faint, acrid smell of something burning somewhere in the distance. My kids clung to me, still in their pajamas, staring with wide eyes at what had once been our calm, orderly neighborhood. I held their hands tightly, feeling the chill of the morning dew mixed with the remnants of storm water, and told them that we were safe because we had prepared. It wasn't just reassurance. It was a truth I knew deeply, having spent the entire previous day planning, documenting, and protecting our home while so many others had ignored the warnings. I decided to start walking the neighborhood, phone in hand, capturing images and videos of the aftermath. Every clip told a story that words alone could never convey. The garden where a tree had collapsed, the driveway half submerged in water, the neighbor's garage door caved in by fallen debris. I recorded families emerging from homes with bewildered faces, some stunned by the damage, others frantically assessing lost belongings. What struck me most, however, was the stark contrast between those who had prepared and those who hadn't. Some houses were relatively untouched, the occupants having taken precautions, while others were devastated because no one had believed the warnings. Each recording was a small testament to the importance of listening, planning, and taking action in the face of danger. By mid-morning, I began to notice something remarkable. As I posted a few clips to social media, first simply as documentation, then with subtle captions emphasizing the severity of the storm, the response started trickling in. Friends and distant relatives began commenting, tagging neighbors, sharing the footage. Messages poured in from people expressing surprise, disbelief, and even shame at their own lack of preparation. I didn't take it seriously. We barely made it through the night. One friend messaged me privately. Another commented under my post, "We thought it would be overblown." Seeing this makes me rethink everything. I realized then that the documentation I had taken wasn't just for my own records. It was becoming a warning, a lesson, and a source of accountability for everyone who had scoffed at the forecasts. The contrast between my own calm, prepared household and the chaos enveloping others was stark. I returned home briefly to check on my children, who were still shaken but relatively unharmed. I offered snacks and warm blankets, encouraging them to help me organize and upload the videos. I wanted them to understand, gently, why preparation mattered, why listening to expert advice wasn't a matter of fear but of foresight. Their small hands helped steady my shaky camera as I filmed another walkthrough of the block, narrating in calm, clear tones. This is why we stayed home, why we prepared. Look at the streets. Look at the damage. It's real. Even as they watched in quiet awe, I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on me, not just for my own family, but for the message that was beginning to spread. By noon, social media attention had grown exponentially. Videos that I had initially posted to a private circle of friends were now being shared across neighborhood groups, local news pages, and community forums. Comments flooded in, some outraged, some incredulous, and others grateful. People were finally seeing the storm for what it truly was, and the evidence I had captured left no room for denial. It was no longer just my voice. It was proof that the storm had arrived, that ignoring warnings had consequences, and that preparedness could mean the difference between safety and disaster. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by empathy for those who had suffered unnecessary loss. Knowing that my quiet vigilance had made a tangible difference, I spent the rest of the afternoon walking further into the neighborhood, documenting homes that had been spared and those that had been hit hardest. I made a point of highlighting examples of effective preparation: houses with secured shutters, reinforced garages, and families who had stocked supplies, juxtaposed with homes that had been caught completely off guard. Each post, each clip, was framed as a lesson rather than judgment, a reminder that responsibility and foresight could prevent tragedy. Even as the notifications on my phone multiplied, I remained methodical, continuing to capture the aftermath, narrate the story, and organize the files that were quickly becoming a record of the storm's impact. By evening, local news outlets began contacting me. Reporters had seen the social media posts, shared footage from my neighborhood, and wanted to verify the details. I spoke carefully with each of them, providing timestamps, recordings, and photographic evidence, while also explaining the context, the storm warnings, the skepticism of neighbors, and the precautionary measures my family had taken. Every statement, every clip, every uploaded image served as a counterpoint to the narrative that nothing had happened. The storm was no longer invisible, no longer doubted, and no longer trivialized. The night ended with my home calm once again, my children safe and wary, and the realization that our story, the story of vigilance, preparation, and quiet action, was now being shared far beyond the boundaries of our street. The next morning brought an eerie calm over the neighborhood, the kind that follows chaos and makes everything feel fragile, like a world suspended in disbelief. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the crunch of debris beneath my shoes and the occasional distant siren breaking the silence. As I stepped outside with my children in tow, I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, but also a strange sense of vindication. We had survived, prepared, and documented, while so many others had been caught unawares, and now, the full scale of the storm's aftermath was visible, impossible to ignore, even for the skeptics who had laughed at the warnings. As we walked, I could see neighbors emerging from their homes, some shaken, some frantic, others simply staring in disbelief at the wreckage surrounding them. The trees that had once lined the streets like silent guardians were now splintered or uprooted, streetlights leaned at impossible angles, and vehicles were partially submerged or dented from flying debris. I filmed everything, narrating calmly, explaining what had caused the damage, and, subtly, what could have been avoided had people taken the warnings seriously. I could hear some of the neighbors talking to each other, voices tinged with regret, frustration, and awe. We didn't think it would be this bad. If only we'd stayed home. But the storm was not forgiving of ignorance, and for many, this was a harsh lesson they would not forget. By late morning, the social media posts I had shared began to gain traction far beyond my immediate network. Local news outlets had picked up my clips, and I began receiving messages from reporters asking for statements, timelines, and additional footage. The videos that had started as simple documentation for my own records were now part of a growing narrative that was capturing the attention of the wider community. People who had dismissed the warnings now faced undeniable evidence. The images of downed trees, flooded streets, and damaged homes spoke louder than any argument. My quiet diligence, my decision to stay home and protect my family, had suddenly transformed into a source of truth for others who had been caught off guard. The reactions online were a mix of shock, relief, and regret. People tagged friends who had gone out during the storm, warning them of the consequences, while others praised those who had followed the warnings and survived with minimal damage. Comments flooded in under my posts. "You were right! We didn't listen and now we're paying for it. Thank you for documenting this. I've shared it with everyone I know." Some people even messaged me privately, asking for tips on how to prepare in the future. I realized then that my documentation had become more than just proof. It was education, advocacy, and a call for personal responsibility in the face of danger. As the afternoon wore on, the storm's indirect effects continued to unfold. Power outages persisted in several blocks. Emergency services struggled to respond to all the calls, and people were slowly realizing that the damage was more extensive than they had initially assumed. I returned home briefly to check on my children, who were tired but resilient. I reassured them that we were safe, explained why our careful preparation had protected us, and involved them in organizing the documentation I had collected. They helped me caption videos, sort photographs, and write brief descriptions that emphasized the importance of heeding warnings. It was exhausting, but it also felt meaningful. We were turning a terrifying event into a learning experience, not just for ourselves, but for the community at large. By late evening, the storm's social impact had fully taken hold. News channels referenced my footage, social media shares skyrocketed, and online forums buzzed with people comparing what had happened to their own experiences during the storm. The contrast between those who had prepared and those who hadn't became a central topic, with my posts often cited as examples of foresight, responsibility, and the importance of taking warnings seriously. Even people outside my local area were commenting, expressing gratitude for the documentation and asking how they could replicate similar safety measures in their own communities. My quiet, painstaking effort to protect my family and record the events had unexpectedly grown into a platform for communal awareness. Through it all, I felt a strange mix of pride, relief, and humility. The storm had tested us, pushed us to our limits, and revealed the vulnerability of those who ignored reality. Yet, it had also shown the power of preparedness, careful documentation, and proactive thinking. I realized that what I had thought of as a simple act of caution, staying home with my children, recording what was happening, and ensuring our safety, had turned into something much larger: a warning, a lesson, and an undeniable testament to the difference between action and inaction. By the next morning, the story had fully escaped the confines of our neighborhood. Social media feeds were flooded with images, videos, and first-hand accounts from people all over the city. But the posts that gained the most traction, the ones being shared repeatedly and discussed in comments and forums, were mine. The documentation I had so carefully captured, the broken trees, flooded streets, damaged vehicles, and our own cautious preparation, was now serving as a cautionary tale for thousands of people. Messages poured in from strangers, local officials, and journalists alike, thanking me for showing the reality of what had happened. My quiet decision to stay home and protect my children, which had once felt like a personal choice, had now become a public record of responsibility, foresight, and care. As the morning progressed, I could feel the emotional weight of the storm's aftermath pressing in on everyone. Neighbors were still cleaning up, some emotionally exhausted, others frustrated at the loss of property or the knowledge that they could have been safer. I walked the streets once more with my camera, documenting ongoing recovery efforts, capturing footage that showed both destruction and resilience. Children cautiously returned to play on streets that were no longer entirely dangerous, families worked together to move debris, and volunteers began offering help where it was most needed. My own children helped me record the community's efforts, quietly understanding that their experience, our experience, was becoming part of a larger story, one that emphasized care, preparation, and shared responsibility. By mid-morning, the reach of my documentation had grown even more significant. Local news stations were quoting my posts, sharing my clips, and asking for interviews. Reporters called for more footage, wanting me to explain not only the storm's path and intensity, but also how preparation had altered its impact on our household. I carefully narrated our experience: how we stayed home, how we stocked essentials, how we created a safe space for the children, and how I documented everything as a record of what was happening in real time. Each word, each explanation, underscored the stark contrast between proactive care and reckless disregard, and people responded. The viral spread of my posts created not just awareness, but conversation, reflection, and, for some, guilt, but also gratitude for the tangible example of what could be done to survive such events. The personal messages were overwhelming. Friends and extended family, some of whom had initially dismissed my caution, reached out to apologize, to ask questions, and to learn from our experience. "We thought it was overblown. Thank you for keeping your kids safe," one text read. Another, "Your posts saved us. We've never been so unprepared, and now we know better." Even strangers, people from neighborhoods and towns far from ours, messaged me to thank me for documenting the storm and showing practical steps for safety. I began to respond, carefully, thoughtfully, sharing tips on preparation, safety protocols, and resources. What had started as a personal decision to protect my children had evolved into a public service, a guide for others navigating uncertainty and danger. By the afternoon, my online presence was no longer casual documentation, it was a recognized source of truth. A prominent weather page had shared one of my clips with the caption, "Real footage from a family who took the warnings seriously. Lessons in preparation and responsibility." Thousands of shares, comments, and reactions followed, many noting the stark contrast between those who had been cautious and those who had ignored the warnings. It became clear that my quiet vigilance, which had initially felt like a private act of protection, was now a template for accountability and responsible action. Even as I guided my children through the cleanup of our own property, I could see the broader impact we were having. People were paying attention, learning, and adjusting their behavior in ways that could prevent future harm. That evening, I reviewed the documentation once more, carefully organizing footage, photos, and notes. The children were exhausted but engaged, asking questions about why our experience mattered so much, why people were finally listening, and why it was important to prepare. I explained that while storms and disasters can be frightening, taking precautions, documenting reality, and acting responsibly could make all the difference. We watched clips together, pointing out moments where preparation had kept us safe, where careful choices had minimized harm, and where vigilance had prevented panic. I wanted them to understand, deeply, that responsibility was not just about fear. It was about foresight, protection, and the courage to act when others dismissed the warning signs. By nighttime, the story had fully cemented itself online and in the community. Local news, social media, and even national outlets referenced our experience, highlighting the importance of preparation and the value of documentation. People who had doubted the warnings could no longer dismiss them. The evidence was irrefutable. My quiet week of vigilance, care, and recording had transformed into something far larger than myself. It had become a lesson for the city, a narrative about responsibility, and a vivid reminder that listening, preparing, and acting decisively can save lives. I finally allowed myself to sit back exhausted, watching the notifications, shares, and messages continue to pour in, realizing that the decision to stay home with my children and record the storm had not only protected them but had also educated, inspired, and affected countless others. In those moments, I understood a profound truth. Sometimes, the quietest choices, staying home, taking precautions, documenting events, carry the most weight. The people who had mocked warnings, laughed at concern, or ignored advice had learned a hard lesson, while our preparation had transformed fear into security and personal responsibility into communal influence. My children slept that night safely, the house intact, and our story, captured in thousands of images and videos, stood as an enduring testament to vigilance, foresight, and the power of careful action in the face of impending disaster. It was more than survival. It was proof that being responsible, prepared, and proactive can ripple far beyond the walls of a single home, touching countless lives in ways we cannot immediately measure but will resonate long after the storm has passed.